Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am about to make another return to the before time milestone. I've got a conference/workshop in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday and Wednesday, so that means I am making my first D.C. trip since February 28th, 2020. You guys who don't know what I do for a living, I'm a lobbyist. I run a trade association, but I also lobby the Congress, White House, etc. We have a firm we use down in D.C., but yeah, I have not been down there in nearly 3 years. It'll be 35 months. My lobbyists are also setting up meetings for me in early February, so it looks like I'm headed back to whatever normal once was. I've already gotten back into trade shows, and now got to get back into the Acela corridor, I guess. Luckily, the train I'm taking tomorrow is 11 a.m., so in a lot of the old times, I would get on a 6 a.m. train, which meant getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, starting the day, blah, blah, blah. I'm not ready to get back to that much of the before time yet, so 11 a.m. train is fine by me. But I am staying at a hotel I used to go to all the time in DuPont Circle, right near Kramer Books, which I think had some issues during the pandemic, but is still around and is a wonderful bookstore. So I am hoping after the Schmooze Fest at the end of day one to head back to the hotel and stop in at a great bookstore for a while and just get on with the way things used to be, I guess. Anyway, let's get to the show. Now, speaking of the before time, my guest this week is Dawn Raffel, who was on with me in the summer of 2019. We recorded in person that time. We did a remote this time because we've got a lot going on. And even though she's in driving distance, we figure we've already seen each other once for a conversation. But that time we talked about her nonfiction book, The Strange Case of Dr. Coney, about the guy who revolutionized neonatal care by popularizing the use of incubators and changing nursing protocols. In the process, he saved thousands of premature babies, and what he did, ended up proliferating and becoming, best practices in hospitals around the world. So he's really saved millions of people. Anyway, the thing is, the incubators themselves, with the babies inside, became, they were part of sideshows in in places like Coney Island and the Chicago World's Fair in the 1930s. Now, Dawn captures the whole history of this stuff beautifully, but the point here is, in telling you about all that, is that it brings us around to her new book, Boundless as the Sky, which was just published by Sagging Meniscus Press. We get into where they got that name from. Boundless as the Sky has two parts, and Dawn will explain the structure better in our conversation. But briefly, the first half consists of short pieces from a paragraph to a few pages and a series of black and white photos. Some of the pieces have a lot of similarities to one of my touchstone books, Italio Calvino's Invisible Cities, and it's deliberate on Dawn's part. But the second half is a novella about a day at the Century of Progress, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. That particular day is when the Italian Air Force Marshal Italio Balbo was leading an armada of seaplanes to land on the lake. And as we talk about, her research for the book on Dr. Coney also fed into this novella and a lot of her creative output. But what I want to get at is the subtlety of this book. It's a brief book. It's about 130 pages, including the full pages of photos and things like that. The threads connecting it all are very subtle, and Dawn manages to well, with all that subtlety, she makes this wonderful read with these gorgeously wrought sentences and characters who seem to live and breathe in the space of a few lines, and the echoing of certain themes. It's almost like a piece of music reading this book. And the fictional cities that she evokes, and even aspects of the 1933 Chicago that she brings in for the novella for the second half, it could easily slot into Calvino and Invisible Cities in certain ways. And the other short pieces, they tease at bigger stories or even books, but they never feel lacking or underdone or sketch-like. They're enough in what they are, but they could tease at so much more, much like life. Anyway, the second half, like I say, it carries a relatively straightforward story. And what's interesting about that is how it contrasts with the sort of fragmentary flash nature of the first half. Almost like it's proving that the writer of that first half could have done this all along if she wanted, but there's a greater purpose in giving us those fragments of invisible cities and different women's lives. And this great short story about a woman and her short story writing partner. And, well, anyway, you need to read this book is what I'm getting at. And I'm just not doing it enough justice, but you'll get enough of my praise of it and our conversation coming up in a moment. Boundless as the Sky. That's the title. It is an absolute gem of a book and truly a joy to read. She mentions how many years she spent working on some of these pieces, and you can feel it in how finely wrought the sentences are. It's a treasure, an absolute treasure reading a book like this. So let's get to the conversation. And here's Dawn's bio from the book. Dawn Raffel is the author of 6 books, including The Strange Case of Dr. Coney, How a Mysterious European Showman Saved Thousands of American Babies. Other books include 2 short story collections, a novel, and a memoir. Her stories have appeared in many magazines and anthologies, including Noon, Bomb, Conjunctions, Exquisite Pandemic, New American Writing, The Anchor Book of New American Short Stories, Best Small Fictions, and more. Her new book is Boundless as the Sky. And now, the 2023 Virtual Memories Conversation with Dawn Raffel. So tell me where Boundless as the Sky began for you, because I have suspicions, but I'd love to hear from you where it came from and how it developed and where it gained the structure that it did.
Right. So Boundless as the Sky has 2 parts. Part 1 is stories and part 2 is a novella. And it took me a while to realize the extent to which they were in conversation with each other because I was writing them pretty much simultaneously. The stories are pieces that I started working on in 2007, and I started to recognize just how strongly I was being influenced by a book that's always been under my skin, which is Invisible Cities. And so I completed them in that vein. And those stories they take place in cities real and imagined, and some of them are dystopian, some are historical. There's definitions floating around in there because it has to do with how we construct city. And for me, one of the cities that has the deepest hold on me has always been Chicago. And the novella came from my obsession with Chicago in 1933, specifically the Century of Progress World's Fair. And around the same time, 2007, I started doing archival research into that fair. And I was obsessed with doing something around that fair as well. And so it took a long time for me to see that these cities that are all over the place chronologically, and then this other story that takes place in a single city on a single day from sunrise to sunup, are actually connected to and in conversation with each other.
You answered about 3 or 4 of my questions.
I'm sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's wonderful, because those are all things I wondered, like how those halves speak to each other and what that moment was like for you when you realized these things were in a conversation or a dialogue.
Yeah, I very often find that I think I'm writing two different things and it turns out they're the same things, even sometimes within a story. And for me, the most interesting thing about the whole process isn't even sentence making, which I love, and I could happily spend all year revising the same sentence, but it's finding really unexpected connections between things in the composition.
Yeah, that's... Well, I mean, I should have opened up, and I will in the introduction, of course, by telling you how much I loved the book for both of those reasons.
Oh, thank you.
The resonances among the themes, but also just the richness of the language and the sentences. Just it was refreshing, given just, types of prose I'm used to reading all day online, et cetera, to just revel in some of the prose and the language that you use in this book. I was just kind of... I was relieved. I was happy to see an artist put that level of craft into sentence on sentence building like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to be too gushing, but it really was one of those moments of, I'm a huge Invisible Cities mark to begin with. It stems back for me when a high school teacher for graduation gave me a copy of a copy that I've subsequently lent out and I'm pissed off about because I had an inscription from him in it. Yeah, I know. It kills me. I've got about 5 more copies since then, but I think I'm pretty sure who has that one copy, and maybe in some phantom city someday I'll come across it, but we'll see. But actually, what is your history with Calvino and Invisible Cities? Do you remember your first
I feel
experience?
like other people are probably far more qualified to have written a book inspired by Calvino than I am. And I'd never have really sat down and said, well, now I think I am going to write a book inspired by Invisible Cities, because I would have just shut myself off right then. I read it as a young woman. It stayed with me. There are certain lines from that book that just, if you love that book, that will just stay with you forever. And then much more recently, say in the past 7 or 8 years, I have brought the book to share with a couple of reading groups that I was leading. And they were discussion groups, and we were pulling out favorite quotes. And it was just kind of in me there. And I've also read a number of interviews with him, a number of other pieces that he's done besides Invisible Cities. I did not allow myself to go back when I knew I was doing this and read it again. I didn't want to get into a matchy-matchy structure. It's not a conversation between Kublai Khan and Marco Polo. It's a kind of a looser connection than that. And I picked up and put down the book many times when I was writing and thought, no, you can't go back and read it again, because I'm going to try to duplicate or replicate or do a one-on-one kind of match. And I didn't want to do that.
Yeah. And it certainly doesn't have that mathematical crystalline chapter structure that he puts into this whole thing. And it's not doing that. As a guy, I will ask, do you consider it a sort of feminine or feminist rereading of Invisible Cities?
Yeah, I do. And actually,
originally, because again, as a guy, I always feel bad doing that. So.
Originally, I described it as a feminist response to Invisible Cities. And then I thought, I sound like an asshole. Like, I probably am an asshole, but that was too much. So I took that out. But it is, I love Invisible Cities, as you know. It's an extraordinary book, but it is a man's book. And it definitely is a woman's response to it.
Maybe, and again, not to mansplain here, but maybe a feminist reading as opposed to a feminist response. Response has a sort of connotation to it, I guess, that brings on that assholic tendency.
Yeah,
I guess,
I'll let it alone, and I'll let people read in it what they want to.
But it was a joy, and it was a different way of seeing these phantom cities, I guess, and not just because we're in a cell phone and smart world age or anything like that, but seeing those sorts of visions rendered like this it was a joy to see or to read. But tell me about Chicago as the visible city. And I apologize for the coughing. I'm still post-COVID.
No.
Christmas Eve.
I'm so sorry.
I put it off for 3 years and that happened. But yeah, Chicago is the most visible of cities.
It's really interesting that you're calling it the visible city. So for me, Chicago is kind of the emerald city of my childhood. Both of my parents were raised there. I grew up in Milwaukee, but we would go back to visit Chicago, and it was just this kind of had a kind of sooty urban glamour that just, I loved it. And because I've never lived there as an adult, I was briefly in school in Evanston, which is outside of Chicago, but it's really my Chicago is a mythical Chicago. It's memory and desire, and it's my own sort of creation. But in my writing, I very often go back to this Chicago, and this 1933 World's Fair. I know that both of my parents would have been there. I'm positive my father was there because he left some journaling about it. And my mother grew up very near to there, so they would have gone as children. By the time I became obsessed with this, they were both deceased, so there was no asking further questions. But my aunt even still had the souvenir program guide. And to me, it was so astonishing that it's 1933. It's like what the worst year. It's the bottom of the Depression. It's a Dust Bowl year. It's the year Hitler came to power in Germany. And yet Chicago is having this World's Fair called the Century of Progress. And it's predicated on the idea that technology and science are going to solve all of our problems. And it was hugely optimistic. People who really, really couldn't afford to go found a way to go anyway. And there's a good amount of archival material because if you went, you saved all your souvenirs too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wanted to set, I really knew I wanted to set a work of fiction there. And I was looking for a particular event, and the arrival of these fascist seaplanes sent by Mussolini you couldn't make that up.
And when you talk about those unexpected resonances, the idea that the first half is working with Italo Calvino and the second half with Italo Balbo.
Yeah.
You're getting your Italo, intersection, I guess. But yeah, the novella, it was funny that to me, the first half and the fragmentary nature and these, jewel-like passages give way to an impressionistic novella, but one that, is written in a sort of different mode that's telling a story in a sense, in a very different way than the first half does. And just seeing how they contrast and play off each other was fantastic.
I think the novella might be the only thing I've ever written in chronological order.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
It was fun.
Yeah. Do you have the bug? Is that it? Or are you going to start telling things at linear?
I don't know what happens next. But partly, we were talking about the pandemic, and partly, because we were under lockdown and there's nowhere else to go, I finally just sat down and wrote the novella, which I had notes for and characters and ideas for years and years and years. And I was still doing archival research when the library shut down. And it was archival. It wasn't research that was digital. So that was it. I was finally forced to okay, now you just have to write it.
Every writer and artist I talk to is always abashed about saying, actually, the pandemic worked out really well for me, in terms of being able to get something done that they may not have been able to when all the resources were available. But don't feel embarrassed if that's your situation too. But when we talked in 2019, you mentioned that sense of the things that aren't digitized, the things we can't search, on Google, but have to actually, go into the stacks or, go to people's homes and see the actual artifacts and things that are left behind. But the other thing you mentioned was that your previous book, The Strange Case of Dr. Cooney, started out as fiction before becoming a nonfiction piece. Was this the fiction?
This was the idea. This was what I was trying to get to. I wanted to write a work of fiction about the Chicago World's Fair. When I stumbled across the fact that one of the main points of interest at that fair was an incubator sideshow, that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. And I ended up taking 4 years to go down a rabbit hole of research to write the true story of those incubators and Dr. Cooney. By the time I finished that book, part of which does take place at the Chicago World's Fair, I thought maybe I had written this out of my system and I could lay it to rest, but no, it was still there. So I came back to this.
I asked at the time whether you dream about or had dreams about Dr. Cooney. Do you have dreams about the World's Fair?
No, I really don't. It would be great if I did. I wish I could just go back and visit. That would be amazing.
Yeah. Because my thing is always dreams about malls that don't exist. But that's a lifetime raised in northern New Jersey will do that to you, I think.
Oh, those 1990s malls.
Yeah. Yeah, that comic stores, bookstore. Somebody brought up the gigantic mall out by the Meadowlands recently and the American Dream and asked if I went. And I said, there's no comic store, bookstore, or video arcade. So really, no, there's nothing that would draw me there because that's what malls meant to me when I was growing up. But yeah, it's the things that resonate, like you say, in our memory and the things that start to permeate and become, the unconscious connections we make, I guess. But tell me about the pandemic writing and, sort of what you, I hesitate to put it in these terms, what you learned about yourself in the process of both writing this and of going through the lockdown experience and what we've sort of gone through in this whole situation for a few years.
Oh, I'm not sure.
It's an enormous question. I apologize.
Much about myself, but a friend invited me to go on a Zoom with her every morning and another writer. And we would just go on Zoom and then turn our cameras off and write. We were writing simultaneously, but not together. And then we would put our cameras back on. So we'd write for a couple hours every morning. And that's a discipline I should probably get back to and haven't. I'm not particularly disciplined about when and where I write. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was mostly,
I understand. It's a weird, huge question.
Mostly I was stuck with my own stuff. And so I just had to sit down and write it.
Were you revisiting books from your past? We've talked about War and Peace, but I wasn't sure if you'd gone back to read that in the 3 years since we last spoke.
No, I finally read Moby Dick. I'm very proud of myself. I had never read it.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's, again, you got in enough readings of Tolstoy over the years that builds up credit, I guess. But still, good. You got to the American side of it. So,
yeah.
Dare I ask, what'd you make of it?
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. After all that, I was so afraid of it. So years ago, it was on a syllabus in a college class, and this professor had a paper on Moby Dick that was due the Monday after Thanksgiving. And I thought, okay, this is awful. And I know myself, I'm a terrible procrastinator, which means it's going to completely destroy the entire Thanksgiving weekend. So I dropped that class, and I never read Moby Dick. So it was finally time during the pandemic. Here's something else I can do, which is read Moby Dick.
Yeah. I think that was the punchline of Zelig, right? The Woody Allen film that he was going to finally get around to reading Moby Dick at the end after coinciding with every point in 20th century history. That was the, I may finally get around to Moby Dick, and then dies. But, making other literary discoveries. Either old authors or new ones that are jumping out at you.
Oh, I'm just, been reading a lot all over the place. So I been reading Chicago. I've been reading a lot of work in translation. I've been reading a lot of books that my wonderful publisher has been putting out.
Oh, you have to tell me, where does sagging meniscus books come from? As somebody who's had a torn meniscus on several occasions.
I don't think it's that. It's a line from the first book that they published.
Oh, good.
It's an allusion from that. Yeah.
As long as it's not something about, orthoscopic surgery, I feel better.
No, it isn't. I think a meniscus is actually just that curved shape.
Oh, yeah, there's that, the meniscus or meniscal rise in water, the way it tends to, water will reach towards the brim of or fluids will reach towards the brim of the container they're in while dipping in the middle.
Yeah,
so
you got
that's a better meniscus than the cartilage in my knee, I suppose.
Okay, so and then there's another press that I just love called Sublunary Editions, and they publish a lot of short works in translation. And I read a book called The Lighted Burrow by a writer named Max, and I'm going to say it wrong. It's like Blecher or Blecher, Blacher, which completely blew my mind. And then I mentioned it to my writer friend in France, and she said, "Oh yeah, of course. Like, of course, everybody has read that, except for you Americans."
There's something to be said for our ugly monoglot ways, I guess. At least it makes us predictable, I suppose. But yeah, it's again, it's one of the things that struck me in terms of how your book came together, how it fits together. That sense of, I don't want to say discovered text, and I hate using experimental novel as a term.
Yeah,
but
me too.
yeah, good. Okay, I'm glad we're on the same page with that. But yeah, that fragmentary, short nature giving way to something larger as it coalesces. I don't know what precedent you had, or whether you were thinking of other novels in the course of this besides Invisible Cities. But I'd love to hear whether you saw other influences or other authors you were deliberately trying not to hew too closely to.
Not really. I don't write that analytically. I write obsessively in terms of sentence making. I revise and revise and revise and throw out and start again. But I guess I don't really consciously spend a lot of time analyzing other texts while I'm writing. So it's all in there, what I've been reading, and I read widely. But I can't.
That would explain why you actually finish things, and I just procrastinate and never actually get anything done, because I'm always worried about who I'm intentionally or unintentionally coming towards as a writer. So it's yet another thing I need to go into therapy for, I suppose. But but that's what reading's for. But yeah, also one of the things I was curious about, I wanted to see how you decided to include photography in the first half of the book, with a little bit in the second half also, but the choice of including photos, not in a Sebald sort of way where they're in a direct dialogue with the text, but the choice of images you use in the main section in the first half.
Yeah, well, there's one story there that it's entirely told in images. It's the Lost City. And I took those photographs a really long time ago in black and white, because I was broke and I couldn't afford color film. And they're a city that doesn't exist anymore, and they seem to fit in with this idea of the imaginary cities and the mythical cities and the dystopian cities. Here's this city that was New York City, but it's gone. So to me, it seemed to fit in that cycle of stories. And then the other images really were from the Century of Progress. And I just felt like the images were so astonishing that I wanted a couple of them in there.
Mm-hmm. Has New York changed for you? I don't want to give away your location. You're outside of New York City a little bit, but
yeah.
How's the city changed?
I like to pretend I'm still in New York, but no.
Yeah, let's just say you're a New York writer. So tell me about your New York.
Oh, it's just completely changed. It was just, well, first of all, I grew up in Milwaukee. So, when I first came to New York, I was walking around with eyes as big as saucers, because we also didn't have the internet. So I had never seen anything like this. And I was broke, and I did buy a Nikon camera, and I bought black and white Fujifilm because that was the cheapest. And I walked all over the city and took photographs of it. And it was just, it was dirty and it was dangerous. But it had this intense creative energy to it. It's very, very different now, right?
So I think, although the danger thing seems to come up, at least depending on, what news you read or watch, but random danger seems to pop up as opposed to a more.
Again, my hope, what I was hoping was that after the pandemic, because for a moment everybody was fleeing New York as fast as they could, and my hope was that somehow or other all the artists and weirdos would come back, but unfortunately it doesn't quite seem to be happening that way.
Money still.
No, but when
dominates.
I first moved to New York, you really kind of could live in New York on nothing. You'd be living in a rat trap. I lived in a 7th floor walk up that was You can, you know, but you could afford to do that.
Yeah. Well, that was Fran Lebowitz's old story that, she lived in Hell's Kitchen and made enough in, I think, a weekend of driving a cab to pay her rent for the month. And that was it. She'd drive the cab for the weekend, and then she would just spend the rest of the month hanging out, writing, and living it up.
Oh, you could do it. My rent was $200 a month, which even adjusting for inflation
is still ridiculously cheap compared to New York today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's well, of the weird media consumption my wife and I engage in now, it's old Barney Miller reruns on Amazon. And when you see their rendition of mid-'70s New York, you realize, I know it was a sitcom, but they were painting a pretty bleak picture of what that city was like. That seemed pretty accurate from, what we remember as kids, in the news and Ford to city, drop dead and all that. But yeah. Ever think of the suburbs, or are you firmly an urban?
Oh, you mean moving to the suburbs?
Yeah.
No.
I live in the woods. I'm 25 miles from the city, so I've always had the city in the distance, a la Calvino. I've always been able to see the skyline of Manhattan 25 miles away and just think, I'm here. It's nice that that's there and I can get there, but, I sort of live just beyond the suburbs here. So, but tell me if you can, one of the things that we talked about last time, the love you have similar to the Century of Progress of Coney Island, and whether you've managed to go back post-pandemic or mid-pandemic to get out there, or if it's changed too much from the Coney Island you once loved.
Oh, no, I love Coney Island. I've been out there, and there's one of the primary characters in the novella, the Bird Girl, is based on going out to Coney Island, going to the Coney Island Museum and watching there. They still have sideshows there. And that character was influenced by looking at those sideshow performers and my decision to include them in the novella about Chicago, because they really were an integral part of those fairs. And we kind of want to look away. You either see them as freaks, or you want to just look away and well, let's not talk about that. And they were really an important part of it. They were individuals with disabilities, and I wanted to remember them in there.
Yeah, we when we talked in 2019, I'd mentioned that I'd recorded with Bill Griffith, the cartoonist who does Zippy the Pinhead, because he'd done a biography of Schlitzie the Pinhead, who was in these sideshows at the turn of the century, and how, well, again, how you find that, as you do in the book, the sense of community among these people, that, they know ultimately they have each other because the rest of the world sees them as other, and to them they have to be there for one another, because otherwise they really are alone.
Yes, and it was interesting to me is that as horrifying as a sideshow seems, what was done to people in this country who had disabilities like that was worse. It was horrific. Most of them were essentially incarcerated in terrible institutions and treated as less than human. If they ended up in a sideshow, at least they had friends, they had community, and they had a little bit of agency there.
And were actually able to earn enough to maybe help their families, as you include in the biographical notes. But yeah, it's still, well, I'd say a different world, but one that I think we still have. We just look at it a little differently, or hide a little differently.
Well, the other thing that there was just a little shadow of there is that it's 1933, and the Jewish characters in the novella are obviously very worried about Hitler. Hitler's first and least remembered victims were people with disabilities. That's who he killed first.
Yeah, what was narratively the challenge of setting it in 1933 and not bringing too much of the future in?
Well,
I mean, you
the
do
reader
in
knows
some
the
of the
future.
Yeah. And how challenging was it? You included in like the descriptions of some of the chapter heads, who the narrators are and who they'll potentially become. But, making sure you're keeping the characters blind in a sense of what's really coming.
Yeah. They were seeing this marvelous display of technology. And although people were concerned about Hitler and they were concerned about fascism in Italy, they also were, they were hoping maybe it won't be that bad. They were hoping maybe Hitler will go away. That was sort of the prevailing attitude at the time. And so I read the Chicago Tribune for that whole month in 1933. And you would see, so on the front page in the left-hand column, there would often be something about Hitler has just seized the assets of enemies of state. And then there would be a big banner headline, which would often be about aviation, which was just the most exciting thing happening at that time. Aviators were rock stars. Every little boy wanted to be a pilot. And it's not really any different than it is now. You really want to read about the news that's exciting and uplifting. You don't want to read about things that are awful and make you feel powerless. We do the same thing now.
Yeah. I mean, there is that if it bleeds, it leads mentality with news also. But yeah, I get, especially the inconceivability of where things were truly going. As bad as you could imagine it, there was no, no sense of, wow, it could lead to what it ended up leading to.
I think some people did see that. I mentioned there was this show called The Romance of the People, which was supposedly the story of the Jews. And it was a fundraiser, and they were raising money at that point to get Jewish people out of Germany. They were really worried about it, but the general public also was still, so they're acting, but at the same time, they're also hoping this isn't really going to happen.
Sure. Yeah, it was, well, again, it made the book that much more haunting, especially because of some of the resonances from the first half where you have a unnamed Milena, Kafka's, one of Kafka's loves, who end up dying in Ravensbrück.
Yes. Well, there's several references to cities that are, they're European cities where you can still see echoes of World War II in those cities. And not only the Holocaust, but also what happened to, the city of where dogs lie dreaming, which I'll give it away. It's Tbilisi in the Georgian Republic, but, it was done by the Russians there.
Yeah. When we talked 3.5 years ago, you had just come back from Tbilisi, I think, on one of the literary seminars you do. Am I misremembering?
No, that's probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I was in 2019.
And you've gotten back to traveling for those seminars.
I was just
recently?
in Kenya. I was in Kenya for 3 weeks. That was
Tell
amazing.
me about that.
Yeah.
How was it?
Oh, it was incredible. We were on the island of Lamu for most of the time period. And it was, it's now called International Literary Seminars. It's an absolutely wonderful program. And it was great to be teaching in person again. It was the first time since the pandemic. Everything I've done has been on Zoom, except for a couple things at the New York Public Library. But this was an in-person intensive with people who came from all over the world. And it was just wonderful to be back in person again, too.
Yeah, what did you have to learn for Zoom, and what did you most appreciate about getting back to in person like this?
Oh, Zoom. Well, when I teach on Zoom, I end up I have all these bells and whistles. I use slides and I use visuals because otherwise you're going to just pass out from boredom staring at those little squares.
Because you always end up looking at your own square anyway, just to see, how you're looking. But
yes,
anyway,
and
it might
it's
just be
awful.
me.
It's the worst. So I, in person, it's just, there's so many things that it's so much better as a teaching experience because there's all the side conversations and the subtle interactions and the being able to pick up on somebody's body language and understand how they're reacting. And, when I teach, I try to really teach to each person. It's not a formula. And so being able to see them in person is a huge difference.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about what you're teaching and sort of what the process is like?
Well, I teach This was fiction. I often teach mixed genre. I teach at the Center for Fiction, and I've taught at some other places, but I incorporate traditional workshopping with some things that I've brought along from my yoga and meditation teacher training. So I try to mix up the analytical and the workshop tools with also just inviting people to look a little deeper into the roots of consciousness and the roots of perception and how subjective it is and how to start to tap into some deeper places. So I make people do yoga nidra with me and other things like that. We have a lot of fun.
We didn't talk about yoga last time, and it's now part of my 5-day-a-week exercise routine. I do sun salutations every morning, but I also twice a week is a sort of 45-minute yoga workout routine that I do. Because at 52, I figure I should start getting into some decent shape. But first, I hope that isn't what led to your broken foot.
No, it isn't. Tripping led to my broken foot. You're doing a better job than I am right now. So yeah, I was successfully traipsed all over Kenya without incident and then just came home and tripped over my own foot in my house. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Trust me. I spent 20 years ago, I went to New Zealand for 2 weeks on an adventure tour where I bungee jumped, took my first helicopter ride onto a glacier, jet boated through river canyons, drank with Australian men, made it through the whole thing okay. On the flight home, I broke a tooth eating a blueberry muffin on the plane. And that was really? I made it through all this and I just crunched. I'm like, oh, God damn it. Yeah. Somehow the most innocuous thing is what did me in. But yeah, not pretty at all. But tell me about the yoga and your history with that, where it began for you and how it kind of integrates into your life.
Oh, I started taking a few yoga classes, and then because I'm obsessive, I had to do a couple 100 hours of yoga teacher training and then another 100 hours of meditation teacher training for the yoga nidra. And I'm more interested in the philosophy than the physical aspect of it, which is good because I'm a klutz. But it's a piece that I've always felt like with the traditional writing workshop, it's so much from the neck up. And by the time we sit down to workshop a piece, it's already a fact. It's already something on paper. So it's already limited in a certain way. And you see this more now. People talk about embodied writing workshops and incorporating yoga. I'm certainly not the only person doing this, but it's a way of asking people to just tap into deeper layers of consciousness, try to find ways to tap into the things that you kind of know without sounding too woo-woo, that you know in the body, that you know on a deeper level, that you know at the cusp of memory, because those are the things that make the work really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's what we're talking about with your book. I mean, there are things that I'm sure you did not see the connections, but they were there early on, things that were resonating that may have been beyond your hearing until they start to accrete and you start to look at them differently. But
yeah, that's why I write. That's what's interesting about it to me.
Are you more disciplined about yoga and meditation than you are about writing?
No, I'm probably not.
Okay. I wasn't sure because you mentioned not having, a fixed writing practice. I wasn't sure if this
Sometimes I am and sometimes I'm not.
Okay. Did you at least let guilt get to you? That's the important thing as far as I'm concerned, is whether you can feel guilty about it.
About what?
Yeah. Oh, about not getting to either the yoga or the writing. Is just, do you at least beat yourself up?
No, I try not to.
Oh, see, you're much healthier than I am. Then. Maybe I do need to take this up.
Yeah. I don't know. Yoga isn't something you're supposed to beat yourself up over. It's like, and you're like, I'm stressed out because I'm rushing to get to yoga. It's like,
yeah. Yeah, clearly I'm doing this completely backwards, but the physical results are nice.
No,
but,
it's good for you. It's really good for you.
But yeah, I put on some ambient Brian music to kind of yeah.
I am disciplined about the meditation part. I am. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got a couple of guests who've been transcendental meditation devotees who swear by it, morning and evening, 20 minutes a day. And that's built into their routine and their lives.
Yeah, it is built into my routine. That is, yeah.
Good. Okay. Because, I figured you had some regular pole star sort of thing like that.
I do.
Yeah. So tell me about ending each part of the book with fire.
Yeah.
Which is a weird jump to suddenly make, but it occurred to me, going back and rereading the first half after finishing the book, I thought you without giving anything away.
The last page of Invisible Cities, that very last paragraph, he talks about the Inferno. Do you remember that?
My story about that is A, that was what the high school teacher inscribed in the book, and B, the day after the election in 2016, and when we were all walking around shell-shocked, wondering what the hell we were doing, for me, there was why do I bother with the podcast? Why do I bother with any of this arts stuff if this is the way the world is heading? And by that afternoon, I remembered the final paragraph of Invisible Cities and thought, that's why. But you tell me yours.
That's it. That's this, and he talks about the Inferno, and if there is one, we're in it. And it's what you do is, now I'm going to misquote it because it's.
I just grabbed my copy. I'll actually read it so the audience gets the stentorian tones, provided my eyes hold up.
Okay.
The Inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here. The Inferno where we live every day, that we form by living together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the Inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what, in the midst of the Inferno, are not Inferno. Then make them endure and give them space.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
This book, the ending of part 1, is a triptych. It's the uses of fire on Earth. And there's certainly references in there to World War II and what happened, after this wonderful century of progress. And then the very end of the book, the end of part 2, is called The Fire Eater. And that's how I wanted to end it. I had these circus performers anyway, and I thought, okay, at the end, I will bring out this mythical, the Fire Eater.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a beautiful close to the piece, and again struck me when I went back. I'm like, oh yeah, no, we end in fire, depending on the century, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. And I went and actually looked at fire eaters also on Coney Island. There's women fire eaters there.
Oh yeah,
there is one.
I had a blind date with one.
Really?
Many years ago. Yeah. Well, not blind. It was an online date back when I was single. So 20 plus years ago. But that was part of the allure. I'm like, she's a fire breather? Well, I guess that's interesting, but it went nowhere because I was too square, I think. But yeah, that's, well, again, as the sideshow thing where you get the disabled people versus the performing people like the fire eaters and sword swallowers, as opposed to Dodo the bird girl. And again, seeing how they what they tell about us, I guess, and the things that we, either see as the limits of our behavior or things that are beyond what we think of as human or normal, I guess.
But the hierarchy in the sideshow was actually the disabled people could command more, the so-called freaks, than the performers.
Yeah, it's real interesting the way those things break out, and again how structures go, and what the market actually rewards, I guess. But you're also I guess the question you mentioned, not knowing what's coming next. Do you feel Century of Progress is out of your system?
Yeah, I think I'm done with it now. I think we can lay this to rest. Because
it's always possible for a weird third book that's poetry this time. I guess, I don't know, to create some multi-genre.
Oh yeah, let me come up with something where I can make even less money. Thanks.
See? This is also part of why I don't write regularly. So as things that will reward my time. But one of the other thing I saw recently, just, looking over your work, you were recently named a fiction editor at Northwest Review.
Yes.
Tell me about the role, whether it's, what it's like being in that sort of position at a literary magazine and what you look for in incoming fiction.
This is a very new role for me, so
okay.
I've just taken it on, and I look for what I've always looked for, which is writing that truly excites me. There's a wonderful staff there, and there are wonderful people reading at the Northwest Review, and so I just am very happy to be among them.
Yeah, well, we both know literary magazines, not in their heyday anymore, but it's still, that's where the writing has to come from in a lot of respects.
Well, they are and they aren't, because in some ways they're the place where the interesting work is still finding a home.
Yeah. I just remember getting the old Poets and Writers Market and all that, and poring over these things, trying to figure out what good fits were. But yeah.
The nice thing about the Northwest Review is it's print. It's a beautiful print journal.
Yeah.
And there is a website also, but it's print.
Yeah. Do you read primarily print or online or digital?
I still prefer print when I'm reading for pleasure, for learning, because I work as an editor. I work full time as a developmental editor, and so I'm staring at a screen all day when I'm editing. So if I'm turning off that brain where I'm specifically working as an editor, then I really like to have a book that I can hold in my hands.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the pandemic casualties for me, that review copies of books weren't being sent and people were sending PDFs, and it was just, I really don't want to sit in front of a screen or hold my iPad.
Nobody wants to open a PDF of a book. You want to pick up the book. You want to look at the front and back cover and flip through it. And I think it's hard. I think it also makes it harder for literary writers that these books don't come in the mail as physical objects anymore. It's just an email, and it's so easy to ignore or delete.
Yeah, I will say I did just get a bound galley of a book for a upcoming author, and I don't mean a ARC or a review copy. I mean literally the printed out pages with crop marks, all bound in one of those like transparent Staples binders. And I thought, oh, okay, the book's coming out in a month and a half. I thought you would have had copies by now, but whatever. You just sent me 400 pages of laser printed text here from a very major publishing company. I'll still
really?
prefer
It was
that.
a major public, because from a small press, sometimes that's,
I know.
That's what you can
For
do.
the small presses, I never, because I know what budgets are like, I never hold it against them. But this was from someone I will tell you off mic. Basically, I was just kind of like, wow.
Yeah, that is surprising.
Yeah, kind of interesting. But, it's for a guest I've recorded with before, and it'll make for a fun conversation. So we'll see. But tell me about the editing, that editing work. Same thing, like the way I assume part of it is interacting directly with the writers, doing that on Zoom versus, how you were doing this before the pandemic, whether there was a significant change in what that work was like.
That really isn't, because as an editor, my clients are all over. So if they happen to be in the New York metro area, it's nice if we can sit down and meet in person. But really, I'm dealing with the words that are on the page.
So it's always an email. Okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I have a conversation. We get on the phone and we talk. But it's, for me, it's trying to get inside the DNA of the work for each individual author, and so that I really understand what they're trying to do and can help them get there. So I'm not an editor who will look at something and say, well, this is how you need to cut and paste it to fit into a slot in the marketplace. I'm much more like, okay, I can see what you're trying to do here, and this is how we can help you get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm formulating a question that I think I asked you in 2019 about the editor mind and the writer mind overlapping. You mentioned how much you would love to just revise, a sentence again and again, but
Oh yeah.
But yeah, that sense of, shutting off the editor. Are you able to just, I just need to write this. I will figure out what it is after, because it sounds like that's, again, how this book in particular came together. But yeah, how much of that
Sometimes,
is
yeah. It's like I will worry about the larger scheme of it later. I sometimes will think I'm mapping things out. And I'll do that for myself, but then I always go way off the map.
Yeah, given that, like you said, this is the first linear narrative you've done. I wonder like what the map looks like otherwise when it's much more of that impressionistic or fragmentary.
Yeah, sometimes there is that kind of map though, but other times I have the pieces and then I also try to see, okay, what's missing here? Is there an emotional note that's missing? Is there something that should come next? Is there something that feels emotionally repetitive and it really should go? And then many of the stories have been previously published in literary journals. And in the front of the book, I acknowledged journals where I'd previously published some of the stories, but I didn't go down the list of exactly which ones had been published there because I revised so heavily and changed titles that to do that seemed like it's not really exactly the same story that they published, because to try to put this together as a whole, everything got changed.
Right. Yeah, I understand. You see those, published in a substantially different form in blah, blah, blah. But like you say, that can get really...
Yeah, it was so much for all of them. And, I've sometimes, it's not really exactly a traditional story collection. I really wanted these pieces to be read in order. And, well, I always want that when I write a story collection, but they are connected to each other.
Oh, yeah. I'd wondered that, whether you felt it was, especially the first half, something you can dip into, or, whether it's better served read sequentially.
I really intend for it to be read sequentially, and that's true of all my collections. I know there are people who sometimes jump around when they read story collections, because I also had a reaction from an editor who read it and just sort of said, well, I really like the writing, but I'm not sure how I would fuse all these pieces together. And I felt like, but I don't want them all fused together.
Yeah, no, that's the point. That's what makes it work so beautifully.
Into an arc. I didn't want, I wasn't going for a traditional narrative arc here.
Yeah. And again, it serves the purpose beautifully. I mean, it really, as I was getting across, the fragments all come together into something, but not it's something that gives the reader room to interpret, appreciate, and enjoy. So.
Yeah, I'm really, really grateful that I found a publisher in Sagging Meniscus who let me do the book the way I intended it to be done, and also made some great editorial suggestions. And so I feel very, very fortunate with that.
Yeah, it's like I say, this one, I was very happy. It's so different than the nonfiction book we talked about back in 19. So it's just a joy to see, a writer like you who can span, that many different forms, I guess. So, but again, I'm busy overpraising you, and you're probably embarrassed, which is why I'm glad we're doing this remotely, so you're not blushing in front of me. So.
Yeah, I am embarrassed. Okay.
But tell me, next international literary seminar, have you planned?
Or is it I don't know what I really don't know.
Do you have a favorite city? Outside U.S., a favorite city to either to visit or to have these sorts of seminars in?
I've enjoyed all of them. I know that seems kind of...
I know, Sophie's choice, but
I don't know. I mean, in 2007, I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, which is just... it's the most beautiful city I've ever seen in my life. And I'm so grateful I got to go, because obviously it's not possible now. And who knows if it would ever again be possible in my lifetime. But I'm really glad that I got to go there when I did.
And a favorite domestic city?
A favorite?
New York?
Chicago.
Chicago? Okay, I wasn't sure. I mean, you love New York, but, Chicago does seem...
New York is, I say New York is home, even though I live right outside the city, so I shouldn't pretend that I live there. But, I love New York and I love Chicago.
Gotcha. And who are you reading? You mentioned Max Blacker. But,
I know.
I've got the name in the notes and tags for this one, so at least we'll get it spelled correctly. But someone can correct us down the line. But who else have you been reading?
Right now I'm reading a book that came out a couple of years ago by Mary Morris called The Jazz Palace, which is it's set in Chicago. Of course, it's historical Chicago, and I'm just loving it. I'm just kind of leaning into every page of it.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else of late?
Oh, I'm sure I am, but and
the other one, last book you read and decided, holy crap, I have to give this to somebody to read. So I need to share this book with someone.
Oh, well, it probably is The Lighted Burrow. Then we're going to go back to that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's always good to, the same thing I'm going to do with.
Going back a little bit, Interior Chinatown. Did you read that?
No, I don't know that one.
Oh, you got to read that. Yeah.
I'm typing it up now. Do you have the author name? I can look it up.
Yeah, yeah. So you definitely want that.
Oh, Charles Yu.
Yeah,
okay.
Charles Yu. I know, because I'm talking on a podcast, I'm going to have to draw a blank, but yes.
No, it's over. This is the one upside of doing these remotely is that I can look things up online while talking, as opposed to when we met in person and are actually, face to face and unable to look at screens, which is detox for us. But anyway, go on.
That's an incredible book. And you, I think, will like it. Cool. He's playing on so many levels.
It looks fascinating from what I'm catching up. And, of course, for me, every book recommendation turns into, is this somebody I can sit down with for a podcast? So that's how we manage to do 50 to 55 of these every year. But my deep, dark secret. That's really partly why I ask for, what people are reading.
Oh, check out Charles Hildeffer. Also, Sagging Meniscus. The latest one is Don't Look at Me. And I'm going to draw, I think, Give Me the Head of Mr. Boots. I don't remember titles that well, but that's what it is.
Yeah, see, Don't Look at Me is the most recent one. Yeah. And it mentions an ex-basketball star discovers lost love letters from Emily Dickinson. I'm on. That sounds great.
Yeah. So, that's another one you'll like.
Awesome. Oh, this is great. I get your great book out of this, and I get to come across some other good ones. So this is fantastic.
Thank you. And thank you for catching the two Italos in the book. I think you're the first person who got that. I am always afraid of hitting the reader over the head with what the thing is supposed to mean. So I hesitated to even say, like, I hesitated to even mention Calvino. And then I thought, I'm just going to say it. And we'll see what happens.
But it's there. It doesn't have to be overt. That's the great thing. I appreciate subtlety, and again, the book really achieves that. You get across things without having to beat us over the head, and you do it really artfully with such beautiful sentences. So like I say, when I do a show like this every week, it's a joy to just get a gem of a book like this and not have it be 400 pages also, which I appreciate. So because I know you love short chapters and flash fiction, and that
I think all of my books probably could fit into about 400 pages, not quite 400 pages, but yeah.
Well, I look forward to the next one, which you swear you have no idea what you're...
No, because I was working on something that kind of imploded. So, no, I don't know.
Okay. I trust that, we will get together sometime in the next couple of years to sit down and have another conversation.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you. This has been great.
And that was Dawn Raffel. As you can tell, I really dug Boundless as the Sky. It's not conventional by any means, but it is filled with beautiful writing, and it has an elusive structure that I found absolutely enchanting. You can find it through good bookstores and through the publisher, Sagging Meniscus Press. You can check out more of Dawn's work at her site, dawnraffel.com, which is DAWNRAFFEL.com. That's got links to her novels, memoir, nonfiction, her articles and press, her editing services, some upcoming events, and more. So go check it out. She's also on Twitter and Instagram as Dawn Raffel, all one word. spelled the same way. I'll have links to that and the book in the show and episode notes for this one. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Just let them know there is this podcast out every week with really interesting conversation with fascinating writers, artists, musicians, cartoonists, and other culture-making people. Now, you can also help the show out by telling me what you like and don't like about it. Tell me who you think I should be recording with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. You can do that by writing me, send me DMs through Twitter or Instagram, send me a letter, send me a postcard. I love postcards. I send out a postcard every day. I started doing that beginning of 2022, and I've kept it up this year. Or you can call my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go over that, just call back and leave the rest of your message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting that you want to share with listeners, but I'd never put something like that on the show without the speaker's permission. So if you do leave a message, let me know if it's cool to share. If you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I'm doing fine. I've got a Substack now that I'm going to start a paid tier on, and you can't make that below $5 a month, which kind of bums me out. But anyway, I'll get that going at some point in the future. My expenses are pretty minimal, especially for a remote show like this. I pay $20 a month for podcast hosting, another $20 a month for the Zencaster, for the recording setup that we use. Otherwise, equipment sort of amortizes over time. The in-person ones, those do run up some money when it comes to tolls and parking and gas and all that stuff, but whatever. That's why I work for a living. But if you do have money to spare or other resources, I hope you'll give them to individuals or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, and other crowdfunding platforms. There are people who need help with healthcare, with the rent, with getting an artistic project off the ground, starting a new business. There's all sorts of things that you can do to help people. And when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank, occasionally give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds. I make targeted election contributions, Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice funds. There are all different sorts of places that you can put your money to try to make a difference. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.